Howdy my totally always Tubular gamers, are back with you guessed it, another video. Thanks for coming back to the channel. If you're new here, maybe stick around for a while. I got a fun video for you. I got another one of those hardest games lists. But today we're going a bit more retro and we're getting specific with the console. Today we're going to be talking about the hardest Nintendo 64 games. The last couple retro videos I've done were on the 64 and it got me thinking, what were some of the hardest Nintendo 64 games I've played? And after brainstorming a bit, looking over all the games I have and haven't played, I've come up with it. Here we have the 10 most difficult Nintendo 64 games that I've played. These are some of the most challenging games you can find on the console and some of the most challenging games of the late 90s. As always, I haven't played every single Nintendo 64 game. I've played almost all of them thanks to emulation in my EverDrive, but I haven't played every single game. I actually haven't tried Body Harvest, so that's getting an honorable mention here. I've heard that game is very difficult, but haven't tried it, so I can't speak on every single Nintendo 64 game, but out of all of the games I have played, I believe these are the 10 most difficult. As per usual with my hardest games list, I'm not looking at games where it's like, oh, if you put it on the hardest difficulty, it's really hard, or oh, if you go for the 100%, then yeah, it's really hard. No, I'm looking for games where it's hard for everybody, where the average player is just going to try to play through this game on the normal difficulty and just try to beat it, not 100% it, not get every single thing imaginable. Just go through the game. And as always with these lists, difficulty is subjective. What I find super difficult, you might not find hard at all. I've had plenty of people tell me that Sekiro's not a hard game and I just suck. I think the game's hard as shit. Where am I going with this? Let me know down below what you think the most challenging games are, or if you agree with my list, disagree, whatever you want to say. I'm always lurking in the comments and I'm always open to game recommendations. I've gotten plenty of amazing game recommendations from the last two videos and I'm endlessly appreciative of all the people who even watch 30 seconds of my videos. And so if you made it to this part already, thank you. You're awesome. Let's get right into the list. Please like, share, comment, subscribe. Got the Patreon and the super thanks. Any support is truly greatly appreciated. I do want to give a shout out to one patron in particular. That is Alex Leal. Hopefully I said your last name right. Really do appreciate it. Thank you very much. Thank you for the requests as well. I hope to get to them sooner than later. Let's get into the most challenging games on the 64. What's number 10? So to start things off, we've got a game you probably didn't expect to see on here, and that is Diddy Kong Racing. Now before you click off the video and go, oh, he couldn't beat the baby goo goo gaga Diddy Kong Racing, he just sucks at games, hear me out for a second. While I don't think Diddy Kong Racing is like crazy difficult or one of the hardest racing games I've ever played, this game's adventure mode has some serious difficulty spikes in it. Like as a kid, I really struggled on the adventure mode for this game, but even coming back as an adult, yeah, I still think it is relatively challenging at times. A majority of the game isn't all that hard. I'd say it's an average level of difficulty, if not even easy, but there are really two things that jack the difficulty up to the point where, yeah, it's made it onto this list. And that is the silver coin challenges and then the boss fights. The silver coin challenges sound easy enough. You're doing just a normal race, but you got to collect all these coins hidden about the race. The thing is though, you still have to come in first. You have to win the entire race and collect all of these silver coins. And the silver coins aren't just placed willy-nilly on the track. Oftentimes they are hidden. Not only are they usually hidden, but they're oftentimes put in off-road areas or straight up just in obscure locations you'd never go to during a race. Like sometimes these coins are hidden in areas where if you ended up there during the race, you'd probably be better off restarting the race, but you gotta go there to go get this silver coin and then still win the race as well. And you have to collect all of the silver coins in the race. Not most of them, not a few of them, all of them. And at first, you know, it's not the end of the world. They're not really off the beaten path, and it's pretty obvious what they all are. As you go through the adventure mode, they become more and more hidden, and by the end of it, you're looking in every nook and cranny on this racetrack just trying to find these stupid coins, and then you gotta win the race on top of it. Even when you know where all of the coins are, because you have to go so out of your way to get some of them, the race can be rather difficult. When I was younger, I had to memorize where every single coin was before I even had a chance of winning the race after getting them all. Nowadays, I can usually wing it, but some of these get pretty tricky. And part of me feels like the whole collecting silver coin aspect of this game just really wasn't all that well implemented, but that's a conversation for another day. The other challenging part of this game is the boss fights. The boss fights gave me a lot of trouble when I was younger, and even nowadays, yeah, I still think they are rather tricky. I mean, the bosses are way bigger than you, they're way faster than you, they can absolutely kick your ass, and if they get just even a little bit too far ahead of you, you're gonna need to restart the race. You have no chance of beating them. At first, it isn't that hard, but once you get to like the octopus, yeah, it starts getting challenging. And then Whizpig took forever to beat as a kid, and even nowadays, I still think he's hard. And yeah, it's thanks to these two challenges that I think Diddy Kong Racing is one of the harder N64 games. There are plenty of easy moments and races in this game, but the silver coin challenges and the boss fights really do ramp the difficulty up. For me personally, it came down to either this game or Blast Corps, and I went with Diddy Kong Racing because this game was way more frustrating as a kid. Blast Corps is just too much fun, but this game had me yelling as a kid. I was yelling at Wizpig. I was like, "You stupid fat pig, I'm gonna beat your butt." But nowadays, I'd probably say something a little more messed up and probably scarier. Let's just move on to the next game now. And so our next game is probably another game you didn't expect to see, and that is Superman 64. Now, there's no way Superman 64 was ever designed to be this difficult. Maybe challenging, but one of the hardest N64 games of them all. They probably didn't intend to do that, but unfortunately Superman 64 and good design don't exactly get along. I mean, this is one of the worst video games of all time, and unfortunately the game's crippling issues actually make the game quite a bit harder than you would imagine. Not only is it painful to play through this broken mess, but every single thing you do in this game is actually decently challenging. I know flying through the rings might look relatively easy, but the controls are so horrible and ridiculously finicky that even after hours of flying through the rings, you're still not going to have a good grasp on these controls. They're like hypersensitive, but at the same time incredibly clunky and sluggish. Sometimes he turns on a dime, other times it feels like you're turning a tank. And if you come to a complete stop, well, you might as well be turning a tank, and it might as well be over because you have pretty strict time limits. You also can't miss very many of these rings. You need to be relatively precise. Seriously, you can only miss a few and then you gotta start over. And at first you only go through rings for, like 45 seconds, maybe a minute or two, but by the end of the game they want you doing these rings for like 10 minutes, and if you fail halfway through, or even worse at the very end, you have to redo the entire thing. Talk about frustrating. And it feels like at times it can just be total luck that you even made it through the ring challenge, where Superman decides to be precise and you're able to actually get through these. And the strict time limits don't end there. This game is full of strict time limits where they give you barely any time to figure out the controls or what the hell you're even supposed to do, and it just requires a lot of trial and error, especially towards the end of the game where you go long stretches with a pretty tight time limit. And then of course the general stability of the game isn't very good. You'll find yourself clipping through the environment, wasting even more time. The frame rate is absolutely atrocious, making combat encounters more difficult than they should be. The controls are just bad all around. This game is just full of issues, and all of these issues make the game way more frustrating and way more difficult than it is any right to be. I'm sure most people, probably 9.5 out of 10 people that have played Superman, give up in the first 30 minutes to an hour, but as someone who's played way more than that, way more than he wants to admit, I can tell you this is a challenging game. And this is not the good kind of difficult, where it really tests you and challenges you and it feels incredibly rewarding. This is the bad kind of difficult, where like, oh, this is so poorly made that now it becomes hard. This is the bad kind of hard. And there's very few games I've played that are the bad kind of hard. I usually just kind of steer clear of those games, but Superman is not one of those games. I've played enough of it to tell you, yes, it is one of the hardest N64 games, and it's, in my opinion, the worst of the N64 games. There's no good reason it should be this hard, and you should absolutely stay as far away from it as possible. And here we have Star Wars Shadows of the Empire. I feel like this game isn't talked about all that much, even when you're talking about Star Wars games. I mean, if you're going to talk about a Star Wars N64 game, you're probably going to talk about Rogue Squadron, and Rogue Squadron is a challenging game. I was considering it for this as well, especially if you try to 100% it, then this game would absolutely be on the list, but that's not how I'm doing this ranking. I'm talking about just generally playing through the game, and I think Shadows of the Empire is more difficult. And, not as good. While there are plenty of missions that don't really give you a whole lot of trouble in this game, particularly the missions at the beginning everyone likes, the later missions actually get really quite tough, where you just get absolutely swarmed by enemies and you can get taken out super fast. The controls aren't great in this game. It can be finicky, it can be sensitive, and it really does take some time to get used to really every vehicle type or when you're on foot, and just getting totally swarmed by soldiers as you're just kind of fumbling the controls isn't the best time, and it can lead to some difficult moments. Am I going to act like every mission is crazy hard in this game? No, but I'd say a good majority of the missions, you'll just get mowed down by enemies. Like, usually stormtroopers have like the worst accuracy of anything in the Star Wars universe, but I don't know, this game decided to be non-canon and let the stormtroopers actually, you know, hit you and aim and kill you, and I'm just like, wow, they can do their job in this game. Only this game. Okay, that's not true. Super Star Wars isn't fucking around either, but I think Shadows of the Empire, while it's not crazy difficult and it's not super complex as to why it's difficult, I'd still say it's one of the more difficult N64 games. Like, especially once you get towards the end of the game, they really do ramp the challenge up, and I remember it taking me quite a while to finish some of the last missions of this game. Even nowadays, I still kind of struggle with it, mostly because I feel like I'm struggling with the controls, but the game does have some challenging moments to it, and I think the game is decently challenging on the normal difficulty. On the harder difficulties, dude, Shadows of the Empire is not fucking around. You will get gunned down so quickly, it's not even funny. But I'm not ranking these games based on if the hardest difficulty is super hard or getting 100%. Otherwise, this list would probably look a lot different. Shadows of the Empire, it's a challenging game. It's one of the hardest Star Wars games of them all. And while I don't think it's amazing, I still think it is a good game, and if you're a fan of the brand, you'll probably like it, but just be prepared for a game that will challenge you. And our next game is the much beloved Perfect Dark. Now, Perfect Dark is obviously the spiritual successor to GoldenEye, and I know I upset plenty of people when I talked about GoldenEye last time, but I think something we can all agree on is that Perfect Dark is the more difficult game. And I really think Perfect Dark is one of the more challenging FPS games of the 90s. Is it the hardest? Is it Final Doom levels? No, but it still will test you. And I also think that original N64 version is harder than the re-releases. The re-release is great. It's the definitive way to play the game for sure. It improves the controls, graphics, and frame rate, but that original N64 version, it is tough. And even if you're not on the hardest difficulty, I still think the game is going to test you. On the harder difficulties, it's really going to test you. Perfect Dark is a hard first-person shooter for a few reasons. The levels themselves are difficult, the enemy encounters are difficult, and then also figuring out where you're supposed to go and what exactly you're supposed to do can add to the difficulty. You're dropped into these decently sized levels that are actually pretty complicated when it comes to the design. Sure, it starts out simple enough and easy enough to understand, but some of the later levels get really complicated. It's super easy to get lost, and it isn't always the most clear where you're supposed to go. That yellow paint everybody makes fun of nowadays would be pretty helpful in a game like Perfect Dark, and your objectives aren't always super clear. You're just kind of told to do something, and at times it feels like it really is just trial by fire. I remember the first time I played this game, I could not figure out how to beat the first level because I just kept shooting the person that you're supposed to take with you. And yeah, that was just me being a stupid kid and a noob and not really understanding how, you know, video games work outside of just shooting everybody. But later levels do actually get pretty complicated with their objectives and what you're supposed to do. And a lot of the time I found myself just kind of wandering, going, do I do this? Do I blow this up? What exactly am I supposed to do? And yeah, I thought that was decently adding to the challenge. And then the enemy encounters, yeah, these are no joke, especially by the end of the game where it feels like everyone and their mom wants to kill you. Like, you just get bombarded, swarmed by enemies that can take out your health like that. Like, there are some parts to this game where it feels like there are enemies around every single corner ready to kill you, and they can all do a shit ton of damage really quickly. And I just remember playing through some of these levels over and over and over and really memorizing where all of the enemies are, because they can just kick your ass really fast, or they'll just wear you down over time, because some of these levels get pretty lengthy and they're just full of enemies all over the place with really powerful weapons. And in that original N64 version, the frame rate just totally shits out and goes down to sometimes even single digits, making these encounters even more difficult. And it can get kind of frustrating by the end of it, because you're just redoing levels over and over and over because you just keep dying, because you just get totally swarmed, even on the easier difficulties. Like, maybe I'm just a little bitch, or I just suck with the N64 controller, but I thought this game got really hard. I thought it got more difficult than GoldenEye. And if I wasn't getting just mowed down by swarms of enemies, I was going, where do I go and what do I do exactly? And really figuring it out trial by fire style, but somehow I finished the game, so I guess I'm not that bad, right? Regardless, I think we can all agree that the game has its challenging moments, but it still is a good game that is worth your time. And so here we have another beloved game. We have Conker's Bad Fur Day. Now, I love Conker's Bad Fur Day to death. I've played through this game several times and the Xbox remake, but I will be the first to admit that this game has a ton of difficulty spikes. Kind of similar to Diddy Kong Racing, there are plenty of parts to this game where it really isn't that difficult at all. It might even be easy. But then there are some parts of this game where the difficulty just shoots on up into the sky, and then it drops back down to a normal level, and then back up into the sky, and sometimes it stays up there for quite a while. There are seriously a few parts of this game that should not be as difficult as they are, and it makes you wonder how much playtesting they did on them or if they did any user research at all. Probably not. Some of the platforming is really perilous and you take a shit ton of fall damage. It can die super easily. Really, any underwater section is just a pain in the ass thanks to the sluggish controls. The part where you're racing hoverboards on lava, and if you touch anything, literally anything, you just die instantly, and the collision detection's kind of wonky. How easy it is to fall off the cliff when you're riding the barrel down the hill, and then really the entire part with the teddies. It's all difficult stuff. Sometimes the controls make the game a bit harder than it should be. Like, the controls aren't great when you have a gun in this game, and those sections are harder than they should be. They're easier in the remake, since the controls and just the general combat is improved in the Xbox version, but the original N64 version, yeah, anytime you have a gun, you know it's going to be a difficult time. The bosses are super up and down as well. Some of them, like the Great Mighty Pooh, are relatively easy and aren't really going to give you any trouble. But then fighting the Terminator or that big teddy with the little doll, yeah, it might give you some serious trouble. And I remember that part after you beat the Hey Terminator where you gotta like climb up and get away from the electric water. Like, it took me so many times when I was younger just to get past this, and even when I replay the game now, I really dread this part. I really just dread any time you go near water. Like, the water controls aren't great, it's super slow, you have a very strict time limit, and it feels like it goes on forever. Another hard part is when you're pushing the dynamite guy who just came out of the porta potty and has to take a shit. This is super annoying. It's not even all that difficult, it just is a lot of trial and error. Really, a lot of this game is just trial and error. You're just gonna have to try these areas over and over and over thanks to the sensitive controls, sometimes questionable hit detection, and just how punishing the platforming can generally be. I mean, Conker dies so easily in this game, and they don't give you a ton of lives here. Not that it means all that much. If you get a game over, you just gotta start the area over. It's not the end of the world. But the amount of times I replayed some of these areas when I was younger, oh yeah, it gets really up there. And the second time I played through this game, I probably finished it in half the time it took me as the first one, just because I knew what to do and how everything controlled. Despite this though, it's one of my favorite N64 games, and it really is one of my favorite games of all time, but it has some really challenging parts. And so our next game is probably a game you expected to see on here, and that is Donkey Kong 64. Again, I'm not ranking these games based off 100% completion. If I was, this game might be the top game. But even just a normal playthrough of Donkey Kong 64 where you don't get everything, it's still a challenging time. And like several other rare games I've talked about today, the difficulty's kind of all over the place for this game. At times, this game is really easy. It doesn't challenge me at all. And then other times I want to pull my hair out. It's so frustrating and difficult. The difficulty really just is all over the place. A few of the levels aren't challenging at all. The boss fights are really easy. They're a joke. Like, none of them put up any kind of challenge. And then the minigames show up. The minigames can just fuck right off. I hated these minigames when I was younger. I would rip my hair out. I was screaming at them. And even as an adult, I still struggle with a lot of these minigames. Some of these minigames feel like just pure luck and bullshit. And I'm just like, what the fuck? Did they even do any testing on some of these areas? Did they do any user research at all? Probably not. User research probably wasn't around for games back then, but some minigames are just brutally difficult. Like where you have to kill the flies with the fly swatter. Like, this just feels random. It's total bullshit. And then you have to do these minigames several times. They repeat like every minigame multiple times and find new ways to make it more difficult, more annoying, and just more bullshit. Like, I remember replaying a ton of these minigames over and over and over and just having no luck. And while I think a majority of this game's difficulty is thanks to the minigames, it's not all of the difficulty. Collecting enough of the collectibles just to beat the game is also decently challenging since you need so much shit. And some of the later areas get pretty big and you'll be combing really every single part of it with every Kong. And then you also need the tokens, you need to find the fairies, and getting these tokens, playing those arcade games, man, fuck that. As a kid, I hated playing the arcade games. As an adult, I mean, I can appreciate that they're there, but I still hate them, man. Fuck Jetpack. Jetpack Refueled, though, that game's kinda good. But Donkey Kong 64 is clearly not a game for everybody. If you don't like collectathons, you're gonna absolutely hate this game, and even if you do, you might still not like it very much. The minigames can just fuck off. I hope I never see them again, but one day I plan on ranking every single Donkey Kong game ever made, so I'm gonna have to see it one more time. I think it's fair to say this game made me go ape shit.
You need to shut the fuck up!
And so our next game is a game I've always wanted to talk about on the channel, and that is Turok 2 Seeds of Evil. I feel like Turok 2 is a pretty underrated game, not just in terms of its quality, but its difficulty as well. I believe that this is the hardest first-person shooter on the N64, and really one of the hardest shooters of the 90s. Sure, it starts out easy enough, you're fighting some dinos with a bow and arrow or a pistol, but before you know it, you're fighting these like dinosaur Terminator things with all these futuristic weapons. And yeah, you get some really awesome weapons in this game, like some weapons that can really fuck shit up, but the enemies can also really just destroy you. Like, especially the later half of this game, the enemies can absolutely just shred you to pieces, to the point where I was just kind of surprised. Like, at the beginning of the game, I wasn't getting much resistance, and I didn't have any trouble with really any of the enemy encounters, but by the second half, really towards the end of the game, every single encounter was giving me a run for its money. And then if you're playing the N64 version, you have to put up with, you know, the N64 controller and the controls, which aren't even as good as GoldenEye and Perfect Dark, so you can get used to them, but they just aren't great. Additionally, if you're playing the 64 version, you gotta put up with the presentation. The frame rate is terrible in this game, constantly chugging and slowing down, and it makes combat encounters all the more difficult. There's a ton of fog and pop-in, and it just makes exploration all the more difficult. And speaking of exploration, that's really what makes Turok 2 as difficult as it is. Like, the enemy encounters, yeah, they get pretty difficult, but it's not like stupidly difficult. You don't get just swarmed by enemies like you do in Perfect Dark. What really makes Turok 2 so difficult is the level design and how much exploration you have to do. Some of these levels are absolutely massive. Like, we are talking gargantuan in size, to the point where it will take you hours to get through them, and you'll have to explore every nook and cranny, and you gotta find all the collectibles if you want to beat this game. And finding these collectibles is a real pain in the ass. Even with a walkthrough, it can be pretty tricky to find some of them. They're really well hidden. And again, these levels are just so big, and it's so easy to get lost in them. Like, they twist and turn all over the place. They're winding. Everything looks the same. Some of them, like the Lair of the Blind ones, this shit took me hours to get through, because I was like, I just can't find the collectibles. I can barely find my way through this level to begin with, let alone finding all the collectibles. Even with a walkthrough, I really struggle to find everything in this game. Oh, and you need to actually do every objective as well. It feels like just such a massive game, and I still can't believe just how big these levels are for an N64 game. The original Turok had its moments, you know, there were some big levels, there were even some really challenging parts, but it really doesn't have shit on Turok 2. Turok 2 has been re-released though, and these newer versions are easier, like with a better map, better controls, better presentation, all the fog's removed, and it's just easier to navigate in these levels. But man, that original N64 version, it is a rather difficult game that you're going to need a lot of patience for, because you'll be going through these levels so many times it's not even funny. Again, even with a walkthrough, these mammoth-sized levels are still confusing. Like, they're just so big and so intricate. I did plenty of backtracking because I finished a level go, I think I got like everything, only to realize, no, you didn't get shit. This game is still a pretty good game. I really do enjoy Turok 2. It might be the best of the whole series, but it is rather difficult. And so here we have a game you might have heard of, and that is The Legend of Zelda Majora's Mask. Now, when you think of difficult games, Zelda probably doesn't really come to mind. Maybe the NES games do, but certainly not like 3D Zelda. But I'll be the first to admit, I think Majora's Mask is actually a pretty difficult game, but it's not difficult in the sense that like you need super good timing or the combat encounters are really difficult. Majora's Mask is the kind of difficult where you go, I have no idea what the hell I'm supposed to do in this game. I have no idea where I'm supposed to go, how I'm supposed to beat it, what my objectives really even are. They don't tell you much in this game. Sure, if you have a guide or a walkthrough, it's a lot more manageable and it's nowhere near as difficult, but I remember when I was younger trying to play through this game without a guide, and I couldn't get like anywhere in this game. They just don't make it all that obvious what you're supposed to do, where you're supposed to go, and how to complete certain objectives, especially with the whole 3-day time limit that looms over you the entire time you play this game. As a kid, I was never able to beat Majora's Mask. I actually couldn't beat this game until I was an adult with unlimited access to the internet where I could figure out how to do some of this shit. And then having to restart the 3 days over and over and losing a bunch of shit until I realized how to like store money in the bank. This game just got kind of infuriating as a kid, as I felt like I was losing almost all of my progress over and over, because I'd have to go back to the first day, and there's a lot of puzzles that really revolve around the 3 days, especially optional content. If you want to get more of the bottles or try to get most of, if not all of the masks, a lot of them are tied to the whole 3-day thing, and if you miss a key moment at a certain time, you basically just have to start all over. I remember as a kid, I didn't get the 3 bottles, so the part with the Zoras took way longer than it should have, and by the time I was done, I was like, ah shit, I gotta rush this dungeon, hopefully I can finish up. Nope, I didn't. I gotta restart and set time all the way back, and yeah, I got pretty mad as a kid and replayed way too many segments of this game. Nowadays, it's one of those games that I think should just kind of be played with a guide on hand, otherwise you're gonna just have a lot of trial and error, and even with a guide, you're probably still gonna have some trial and error. And go ahead, call me a Neanderthal or super unobservant, but I really think this is the most difficult of the 3D Zelda games. Like, this game is the most cryptic of any 3D Zelda game. I've never had so many issues just going through a 3D Zelda game. Usually, eventually I figure it out, but with Majora's Mask, I just felt like I had to get a guide out, otherwise I'd be here for hours and hours and hours, and as a kid I didn't have that time, and I certainly don't as an adult now. It's probably my biggest issue with Majora's Mask as a whole is just how cryptic at times it can be. I mean, I love the game still, I love the atmosphere, the art direction, and the presentation, and I think it's a fantastic game, but it's a difficult one that even with a guide, you're probably still going to struggle a bit with. You knew a list of most difficult N64 games had to include F-Zero somewhere. Well, here is F-Zero X. Now, the F-Zero series is probably the most difficult racing game series of them all. It's either this or Wipeout, and F-Zero X is one of the hardest games in the series. It's a fantastic game, one of the best if not the best racing game on the 64, but it is going to kick your ass. You need really good timing, mastery of these tracks, and some luck on your side if you want to beat this game's Grand Prix mode. It is a super fast, futuristic racing game where you race 29 other racers all competing for the top spot. But the racing in this game is quite intense. It's rather white knuckle actually. You do have health, it's known as your energy, and when you boost it uses that energy, and if you bounce against the walls a bunch or the other hover cars, you're going to explode and die and lose a life. You actually do have lives and you will have to start the entire race over, and that's just from bouncing off the walls and stuff. Some of these tracks get absolutely loony and have you do these crazy jumps or corkscrews or flips. Like, they seriously go up and down and all around, and you can very easily fly off the track, and you just got to restart the entire race, and if you lose all of your lives, you got to start the whole Grand Prix over. It's like, forget winning the race. Can you survive the race? Can you actually get through the track without being destroyed or losing all of your lives? At first, it's very manageable. None of the tracks are crazy difficult. You go super fast. You get acclimated to the controls, how smooth the frame rate is. Like, the frame rate is fantastic for an N64 game. It's a solid 60. Sure, it's not graphically intensive, but you really get used to the game. It's the later cups where it's like, oh, you've gotten decent now? Yeah, right. We're going to find out if you actually have. And yeah, the last few tracks, really the last few cups, will just come in and kick your ass. Like, these are some of the most difficult races you will find from the 90s. You need crazy good reaction. You need to have just complete mastery of these tracks and know how to just even get through them, let alone win. And then the AI themselves are no joke either. They can take you out and just straight up ruin your day. We're not talking about the nice take you out, you know, we're gonna go Cheesecake Factory, we're gonna go to Wendy's or anything nice. No, we're talking about like they're gonna push you over into the gutter, kick your face. It's not fun. The AI at times feel like they might even be cheating. The rubber banding might be all over the place, but it is still possible to beat the Grand Prix mode. I've done it. I don't know how the hell I did it, but I can say that it was crazy rewarding when I did. This is one of those incredibly rewarding racing games that really will just straight up punish you for even the smallest of mistakes, but you will come back an absolute pro. You'll be able to just destroy the enemies, go through these tracks like a pro, and you will actually win, and you'll go damn fast while you're doing it. Like, this is such a fast game. It's one of the fastest racing games of the 90s, but it is also so much fun. I really did love my time with this game, even if I wanted to pull my hair out at times just because of how difficult it got and just getting thrown off the track or killed by the AI. But I kept getting up, I kept going at it, and yeah, I think it was rewarding enough to the point where I would recommend somebody play through this game. Just know that you are in for one of the hardest racing games ever made. And then what I believe to be the hardest game on the N64, Jet Force Gemini, another Rareware game, but man, Rare has put out some really difficult games in the past. I mean, they put out Battletoads, and while this game isn't as hard as Battletoads, it is still a challenging game. It was a real toss-up for me between this and F-Zero X, and F-Zero X probably requires more skill, precise timing, and better reflexes, but I think Jet Force Gemini is the harder game at the end of the day. Don't let its cute characters or fun aesthetic or unique world fool you, this is a hard game. It's also a very frustrating game. It's maybe the most frustrating game on this list, and it's not because the game is super glitchy and broken and the controls are unusable like, say, Superman 64. This game is frustrating for a few other reasons, especially the N64 version. So this is a third-person shooter with a lot of platforming and exploration, and I'll just immediately say while the firefights and general combat are challenging, it's not crazy difficult. It's not even one of the hardest on this list. Sure, it puts up a bit of a challenge, but it's nothing too unmanageable. The bosses can be a bit of a pain, but it's nothing unmanageable. What makes this game way harder than it should be is the fact that you have to go for a completionist mentality, where you really do have to collect everything and hopefully not commit charity fraud. There are two main collectibles: getting all your ship parts and rescuing all the tribals. It doesn't sound that difficult, and getting the ship parts isn't that difficult, but rescuing all of these tribals, man, this is what just ruins the game low-key. This is what makes the game super frustrating and difficult. There are 9 missions in this game, 3 for each character, and some of these levels are just straight up labyrinthian. Like, we are talking massive, very easy to get lost in, navigation can be kind of difficult, and then you have to find all of the collectibles in every area. And so you'll spend a lot of time just combing these areas trying to find the tribals, but it gets worse. So much worse. The tribals are usually in really precarious situations, and they can actually be killed. They can be killed by enemies, friendly fire, they can fall off the cliff, they can actually very easily get killed, and you have to rescue all of them. If one of them dies, you have to restart the mission. It is as bad as it sounds. It is so easy for them to get killed, whether it was on accident or the enemy just guns them down. It is so annoying. And because of this, you're going to have to replay missions over and over. You're going to have to know where all the tribals are and then quickly rescue them as fast as possible. And if any of them die, literally if you do not have a perfect run, you have to start over. And again, these levels are so big. They're so long. They go on for such a long time. There's so much margin for error. Like, this is just overly punishing. There's no reason it should be this hard. Like, they shouldn't have been able to be killed to begin with, but you also shouldn't need to collect every single one. This is just ridiculous. It ruins the pacing. It makes this game incredibly frustrating, and I never beat it as a kid. This game was way too freaking hard for me as a kid, and I didn't want to redo shit over and over and over. When I was older, yes, I was able to get further in it, but at what cost? Time. That's what cost. This is probably a 5 to 10 hour long game that will take sometimes upwards of double that because of how much you'll have to replay these levels. You'll really have to master these levels. You'll have to be able to get the tribals without them getting killed, do all the combat and enemy encounters, some platforming, a ton of exploration, some boss fights. Yeah, this game just feels relentless at times. Like, from the first mission all the way to the end, it just feels like an absolute gauntlet. And the difficulty doesn't end there either. The controls, they're not great. They're pretty clunky. They take a good amount of time to get used to. That adds to the difficulty. And then if you're playing the N64 version, this frame rate is shit. It gets super choppy, it slows down, and it just makes the gameplay even harder. I mean, it's not like game breaking, but it makes the game certainly more difficult because any action game running at 10 FPS is going to be harder than a 60 FPS game. The re-releases do fix the controls and the frame rate, but this is still a really hard game. And it's with all of this combined that I think Jet Force Gemini is the most difficult N64 game. Again, it doesn't have like a super high skill ceiling. You don't need crazy good reflexes or timing or being super precise like F-Zero X. F-Zero X is harder in that aspect, but overall as a package, yes, I think Jet Force Gemini is harder. It's more frustrating, it's longer, and it really just made me question what the hell I was doing. Jet Force Gemini is still a good game, but it is a frustrating one, that's for sure. Anyway, that's it for today's video. Hope you all enjoyed it. Hope it was what you were looking for. Let me know down below some really difficult games you played on the 64, or what kind of difficult game lists you want to see in the future. If you made it to this part of the video, you can say our code word, which is slime, as in the Dragon Quest enemy. I don't know why I thought that. I'm just in a Dragon Quest mood right now. Hope you all have a wonderful day. See y'all later. Merry Christmas.